Imagine a time when nearly the entire continent of Africa was under foreign control. By the early 1900s, European powers had carved Africa into colonies like slices of pie. Britain ruled vast territories. France controlled huge parts of West and North Africa. Portugal held onto its coastal strongholds. Belgium dominated the Congo. In fact, over 90% of Africa was colonized. But in the middle of this colonial storm, a few countries stood their ground. They resisted invasion. They defeated powerful European armies. Or they used diplomacy so skillfully that colonization never took hold. Today, we are exploring the African countries that were never colonized and the remarkable stories behind their survival. Some of these stories involve brilliant leaders, strategic diplomacy, and one of the most shocking military defeats in colonial history. Let's begin. 1. Ethiopia, the symbol of African resistance. When people talk about African independence during the colonial era, Ethiopia stands at the center of the conversation. Ethiopia is widely known as Africa's oldest independent nation. While most of the continent fell to European empires during the Scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, Ethiopia managed to resist. But this independence did not come easily. One of the most important moments in African history happened in 1896. Italy, eager to build its own colonial empire, attempted to invade Ethiopia. They expected an easy victory. After all, European armies had already defeated many African kingdoms with modern weapons. But Ethiopia was different. Under the leadership of Emperor Menelik II, the country prepared for war. Menelik united different Ethiopian regions, gathered a massive army, and purchased modern weapons from European suppliers. When the Italian army marched into Ethiopian territory, they were confident. But what happened next shocked the world. In the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopian forces decisively defeated the Italian army. It was one of the first major victories of an African nation over a European colonial power in modern history. Italy suffered a humiliating defeat. Thousands of Italian soldiers were captured or killed, and Ethiopia remained independent. This victory became a symbol of African pride and resistance across the entire continent. For decades afterward, Ethiopia stood as proof that European colonization was not inevitable. However, history would later take another turn. In 1935, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini launched another invasion. This time, Italy briefly occupied Ethiopia. But even then, Ethiopian resistance continued. By 1941, Ethiopia regained its independence. Because of its long history of sovereignty and its successful resistance during the Scramble for Africa, Ethiopia is widely recognized as one of the only African nations that was never fully colonized. 2. Liberia, a different kind of story. The second country often mentioned in discussions about uncolonized African nations is Liberia. But Liberia's story is very different from Ethiopia's. Liberia was founded in 1847 by freed African-American slaves who were sent from the United States to settle in West Africa. This movement was supported by the American Colonization Society, an organization created to relocate freed slaves. The settlers established a new nation along the West African coast and named it Liberia, meaning land of the free. The capital city was called Monrovia, named after U.S. President James Monroe. Because Liberia was established by freed slaves rather than conquered by European powers, it remained politically independent during the colonial period. However, the reality inside Liberia was complicated. The Americo-Liberian settlers, descendants of the freed slaves, formed the ruling elite. For over a century, they dominated the government, economy, and politics of the country. Meanwhile, the indigenous ethnic groups who had lived in the region for centuries often had little political power. Despite these internal challenges, Liberia remained officially independent while most neighboring countries were under European rule. For this reason, Liberia is often listed alongside Ethiopia as one of the only African countries never colonized. Countries that almost escaped colonization. While Ethiopia and Liberia are the most famous examples, there were other African nations that came very close to avoiding colonization entirely. One of these was Morocco. Morocco had long been an independent kingdom with strong diplomatic ties to Europe and the Middle East. In fact, Morocco was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the United States in 1777. However, during the early 20th century, European powers increased their pressure. By 1912, Morocco was divided into French and Spanish protectorates. Although the Moroccan monarchy continued to exist, real political power was controlled by colonial administrators. Because of this, Morocco is generally considered colonized, even though its royal institution survived. Another example is Egypt. Egypt had powerful rulers and a long history of independence. But after the construction of the Suez Canal, Britain became deeply interested in controlling the region. In 1882, British forces occupied Egypt and effectively controlled the government for decades. Even though Egypt technically remained part of the Ottoman Empire and later became a kingdom, British influence meant it was not fully independent. Why so few countries escaped colonization? By the end of the Scramble for Africa, almost the entire continent had been divided among European powers. So why did only a few countries escape colonization? There were several key reasons. First was military strength. Ethiopia was able to resist because it had a large, organized army and access to modern weapons. Second was strong leadership. Leaders like Emperor Menelik II used both diplomacy and military strategy to defend their countries. Third was international politics. In Liberia's case, its close relationship with the United States discouraged European colonization. And finally, geography and timing also played a role. Some regions were harder to conquer, while others had stronger political institutions before Europeans arrived. The legacy today. The independence of Ethiopia and Liberia had a powerful impact on African history. During the 20th century, when African countries began fighting for independence from colonial rule, these two nations became symbols of hope. Ethiopia's victory at Adwa inspired anti-colonial movements across Africa and the African diaspora. Liberia became a meeting point for African leaders and intellectuals advocating for Pan-Africanism. Today, both countries remain important political and cultural centers in Africa. Their histories remind us that even during one of the most aggressive periods of colonial expansion in world history, resistance was still possible. In conclusion, the story of Africa's colonization is often told as if the entire continent was completely conquered. But history is rarely that simple. In the midst of imperial expansion, a few nations held on to their independence. Ethiopia stood strong on the battlefield. Liberia navigated a unique political path to sovereignty. Their survival was not just a matter of luck. It was a result of strategy, leadership, and determination. And their stories continue to inspire millions today. Because sometimes, even when the world seems stacked against you, history can still be rewritten. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more fascinating stories about African history and global events. And tell me in the comments, did you already know which African countries were never colonized?